Hi, my name is Alex. I work for an environmental education organisation called Global Action Plan. We're based in Ballymun in Dublin, and we work with schools, we work with community groups, and we work with businesses to try to support people to make sustainable changes to their lives and to their local areas. We believe that everybody's actions matter, and today we're going to look a little bit at some kind of actions that maybe you haven't really considered in the context of climate change and ask, why don't we do some of these as well? So let's start by getting the temperature of the room. We're going to have a little bit of a moving debate to start. In a minute, I'm going to ask you to stand up. I'm going to read you a statement, and then I'm going to ask you to move to the left of the room if you agree with the statement, and to the right of the room if you disagree with the statement. Are you ready? Stand up. Here's your first statement. Climate change is an important issue. If you agree that climate change is an important issue, move to the left side of the room. If you disagree and think climate change is not an important issue, move to the right side of the room. I'll give you a couple more seconds to move. Left if you agree, right if you disagree. Okay, take a look around you. How many people do you think agree with that statement? What percentage is that? About 70, 80, maybe more? How many people disagree? Okay, good. Here's your next statement. I trust older generations to tackle climate change. I trust older generations to tackle climate change. If you agree that you trust older generations to tackle climate change, move to the left of the room. If you disagree and you don't trust older generations to tackle climate change, move to the right of the room. Okay, I imagine we had a few people moving there. So look around you and see what the number of people, how many people agree with that statement, what percentage, how many people disagree with that statement, what percentage. Okay, here's your final statement. I actively campaign and get involved in projects for the climate. If that's true for you, move to the left side of the room. If that's not true for you, move to the right side of the room. Okay, again, look around, try and get a rough percentage. How many people actively campaign and get involved in projects, and how many people don't? So, you're actually not the first people to be asked these questions. Based on research that's been done with young people in Ireland, 86% of young people identify climate change as being important or very important. That's the first question I asked, and I imagine a lot of you would probably have agreed. And 78% said that they don't trust older generations to tackle climate change. When you think about older generations, that's our politicians, that's our business leaders, maybe even our parents. We don't fully trust them. You young people, maybe not me so much anymore, don't fully trust our adults, the older generations, to tackle climate change. Now, here's the really interesting one. Only 34% are actively campaigning for change, and only 24% are involved in a project that can affect their local communities. So my question to you is, why aren't young people in Ireland, if they believe that it's an important issue, why aren't they more active in campaigning? I'm going to explore some of the ways that we can answer this question, but first I'd like you to go back to your seats. Sit down, thanks. So the topic of the day is climate activism. So I want you to have a think. What images and ideas come to mind when you hear this phrase, climate activism? I'm going to give you 1 minute to talk to the person next to you, and then I might offer you some examples of what I think about when I think about climate activism. So I hope you came up with some good examples of climate activism. Here's a couple that I thought you might have thought of. Up in the top left, obviously, you can see Greta Thunberg with her school strike for climate. In 2018-2019, on Fridays, she started striking from school and saying, until my government acts on climate, I'm going to keep striking from school. Her weekly protest then ballooned into an international global movement called Fridays for Future. And the protest on the top right, you can see, is a school strike from the Fridays for Future Ireland movement. You might also think about people who are getting out there and doing things like planting trees. And Elizabeth Wakuthi, down in the bottom left corner, runs a program called Green Generation that does some really, really amazing things around education, around tree planting and the value of ecosystems. Another thing you might have thought of is Just Stop Oil. They have had a recent series of protests where they disrupt sports matches and they maybe throw soup on paintings, but a lot of their actions have gained a lot of attention. So I've given you a few different examples of climate activists, but based on those, do you think you could come up with what a definition for climate activism is? Have a think, discuss it with the person next to you, and if you get time also, think about how is that different to regular climate action. Okay, hope you're able to come up with something. Here's my attempt at a definition of climate activism and how I think about it as different from climate action. For me, there's lots of things that come under climate action, things that we need to do in terms of reusing things, buying secondhand, cycling more, flying less. All of these things are really, really important. But there's a certain kind of maybe subset of actions that we could say goes above and beyond changing our daily behaviour and tries to achieve more widespread social or political change. And for me, those constitute climate activism. Climate activists are taking direct and noticeable actions to achieve their ends. So I'm going to use this phrase direct action instead of activism in the future, just because I think it's a little bit more specific about the kind of climate actions to achieve an end. So what do I mean by noticeable? Well, here's 4 words that I associate with direct action. Very often you can see direct action is very creative. Campaigners and activists very often have very visual, very imaginative ways of communicating their point and getting their ideas across. And sometimes these actions can also be quite disruptive in that they interrupt some of our day-to-day lives or some of the things that we take for granted in order to make a bigger point about the direction that our climate, say for example, or society in general, is going. For me, it's also quite important that direct action be non-violent, and I distinguish non-violent from disruptive in that non-violent for me means that nobody physically gets hurt. And then also we're thinking a little bit more about how they can be collective. So collective actions are a group of people coming together, raising their voice together, making their point, and saying the kind of vision, the kind of change they want to see in their society. So we're going to play a little game called What Do You Stand For? I'm going to give you some examples of direct action. And if you think that this is something you would do to influence policy or influence change on the climate, I want you to stand up. But if you think it's something you wouldn't do, just remain in your seat. We'll have a bit of a discussion of all of these and the efficacy of how useful they might be at the end. Are you ready? Okay, here's the first. Number 1, protests and strikes. And as an example of this, I'm going to explore the Fridays for Future movement. So inspired by Greta Thunberg's school strike for climate, students from other countries around the world started striking on Fridays in order to demand of their government that they stop fossil fuel emissions, But they also had a specific local flavour as well. So, for example, there in the bottom left in Peru, they were campaigning against government inaction on oil spills, where in the top left in America, we're campaigning about indigenous land rights. In Sierra Leone, for example, the protesters focus more on greater access to climate change education. So one really interesting dimension is that although they kind of share the same core demands, specific focus of each country is a little bit different. So would you join a strike or a protest to force government action to support climate action? If so, I want you to stand up. And if not, remain seated. It's okay. Anybody? Anybody? Oh yeah, you over there? You're standing? Cool, excellent. What about, no? That's totally okay too. How many people have I got standing? All right. Okay, cool. Excellent. Okay, sit down. The next thing I want to think about is disruptive climate action. We've seen a lot from Just Stop Oil around interrupting sports matches. That picture there is in the Crucible and playing snooker, but we've seen it at Wimbledon, we've seen it at soccer. And I suppose their big point is that this harm is happening, and if we don't call attention to it now, then we might just sweep it under the rug. There's other kinds of disruptive protests as well, and I want to point to this one that I really admired. Leitrim, where some climate activists pulled up Sitka spruce. So they're generally in favour of tree planting, but they said that the kind of trees that Quilcher are planting are just biodiversity graveyards, and that's not good enough. So they said that in spite of all their campaigning, the government hasn't listened, so they're taking this direct action of pulling these trees up. If you think you would cause a disruption to support climate action, I want you to stand up. And if you wouldn't, I want you to sit down. Anybody? I get the feeling there might be a few disruptive people out there. Yeah? Feel like causing a disruption? Go on, stand up. Okay. Good. All right, sit back down. Another way that you might support direct climate action is by actually going out there and doing the work, volunteering, getting something done. I offer you the example of Elizabeth Wathuti. She's a Kenyan environmental educator who works with Green Generation Initiative. In fact, she set the organisation up, and they go out and they encourage and educate young people about the importance of wildlife and the importance of trees, get trees planted and in the ground. And she's doing this, she says, for the next generation, for future generations for whom we've borrowed the planet. Another really good example of a young person who's taking things into her own hands is Flossie Donnelly, who has an organisation called Flossie and the Beach Cleaners. And they go out there and they're working on beaches and collecting, and they're working with community groups, they're working with schools, they're working with businesses as well, to get people involved, getting them out there. And I really like this quote from her where she says, if you stop and think that any piece of plastic that you pick up could have ended up in the stomach of some kind of marine life. And so just every single action that she takes, she feels is important. So if you think you would do some voluntary work to improve your local environment, I want you to stand up. And if not, you can remain seated, that's okay. Couple there, maybe? Yeah, just giving you some ideas. Don't worry about it. Okay, thanks so much, sit down. The next idea I want to offer you is taking legal action against a government or against a company in order to force them to change their ways. Now, at the moment, in the European Court of Human Rights, there are 6 young Portuguese people who are taking a legal case against 32 European countries, alleging that they're failing to protect their human rights and protect them against climate change. But I just wanted to offer you a couple of examples of some really successful cases in the past. At the top there you can see a group of First Nations people in Australia who have taken a case against a coal company and managed to stop them from mining on the First Nations land. And also underneath there's a similar case to the Portuguese young people, but here it's a group of young people in Montana who, I think it was last month or the month before, sued their government to force them to change their energy policy, to force them to move away from coal emissions and towards more renewables and environmentally friendly sources of energy. And I thought this was a really powerful quote from one of the plaintiffs. She said, "I don't want to have to fight my government for a livable future, but it's clear that I must." I want you to stand up if you think you would sue the government or sue a company in order to force climate action. Go on. Who's some litigators around there? Any little Donald Trumps around there? Anyone? And if you're not, remain seated, that's totally fine. All right, who's some suers, who's some legals? Okay, good. All right, everyone sit down. I just want to offer you a couple of other ways that you might take direct action. And again, there's so many different ways and so many different ways to appeal to people. Here's lobbying in terms of writing letters, writing emails, contacting politicians and trying to get your message on the agenda. And the Irish School Sustainability Network has a really great letter writing campaign, which I'll link to you at the end of this presentation as well, which you can look into. Another way to take direct action on climate change is this idea of teaching. This program here is Teach the Teacher. It's set in the UK, but it's young people going out and communicating with teachers, and then working together with teachers, they spread that message to other classes. And that's something that you could do in your own context, right? So teaching is another form of activism. The final one I want to offer you is this idea of artivism or craftivism. And there's a couple of really cool examples here. This bottom left is a mural on a wall in Skerries around hope and action in a time of climate crisis. And then this one on right was another UK-based campaign where people crafted little tiny canaries to symbolise the canary in the coal mine. If you're not familiar with that phrase, the canary in the coal mine means something bad. It's a warning of something bad that's about to happen. So these crafters crafted these tiny little canaries and sent them to all the MPs in the UK, who every MP received one of these little canaries saying climate change is coming down the line. So another way to use your skills and talents to send a message out there. So finally, I want you to stand up if you think you would do any of these to encourage climate action, and if not, remain seated. Any crafters, any teachers out there? Okay, cool. All right, thanks. Everyone sit down. Okay, so I've given you a lot of examples of ways that possibly we could take direct climate action. We talked about protests and strikes. We talked about really disruptive activities. We talked about volunteering, legal action, lobbying, teaching, artivism, and craftivism. Now, you've got about 3 minutes. I want you to talk to the person next to you and say which of these actions are likely to influence governments. Which of these do you think might change the policies of fossil fuel companies? Which of these might challenge the perceptions and ideas of the wider public? And which of them might not, and why? I'll give you about 3 minutes, and I'll give you a warning when we've got about 30 seconds left. All right, about 30 seconds left. Okay, I hope that was an interesting discussion. I hope you came up with some ideas that maybe might shift the dial a little bit and get some ideas out there and get your message out there around climate change and climate action. I want to use the rest of the session to have a little debate about an ethical issue. So we've talked about disruptive action and how, Just Stop Oil maybe are throwing soup on paintings, and often Just Stop Oil, they also engage in things like slow marches, walking slowly along streets. Also, they've done things like tie themselves to gantries on motorways. And I want to take a second to think about the ethics of this, because for me it's a little bit of a grey area, and I think it's a really, really interesting one to explore. So, your teacher should have a worksheet that they're going to distribute to you now. Thank you very much, teacher. And on this worksheet, there's 6 different quotes from 6 different people who've been involved in or affected by direct action. Now, I want you to think about 4 questions. First of all, what does each person describe as the problem? Second of all, who thinks that disruptive action is a good way to address this problem? Who has more power in these situations? Who has less power? And finally, what kind of world does each speaker want to see, based on the quote? So, I'm going to give you about 4 or 5 minutes to read the quotes, discuss the questions. Teacher, don't stop this video, keep it playing, and I'll tell you when there's about a minute left. Okay, you've got about 30 seconds left. Teacher, if you want to, you can pause here and take some feedback from the class. And if not, everybody else just wrap up your conversations, 30 seconds. Okay, so I hope you had a really good discussion around the nature of the problem and why people propose disruptive action is a solution. I'm not going to tell you those solutions because I want to ask you to do something different now. And I want you to take a second, look at the bottom of that worksheet and see that little table. What are the arguments for and against engaging in disruptive direct action, as these people explain? So list some of the arguments in favour and list some of the arguments against. I'll give you 3 minutes. Talk to the person next to you. What are the arguments for and against? Go. Okay, just 30 seconds, so finish your point very quickly. 30 seconds. Okay, so for me, here are some of the arguments for or in favour of disruptive direct action. A lot of people will say there's a moral pressure to do something. And also, there's a power in feeling like you're doing something. There's a power in community. There's a power in being together with people, raising your voice, and just trying to force the dial. We here in Ireland have very high carbon footprints down to how we're living, and if we manage to reduce our emissions, we could see it as an action of solidarity with people who are living in the global south, who are going to be worse affected and sooner affected and currently are being affected by the consequences of climate change. We have power to make a difference for future generations and for people in the global south. Also, we can argue that maybe we're combating government apathy and non-responsiveness. And also, taking this kind of action does put pressure on vested interests like the fossil fuel lobby. It forces them to explain why they are continuing to release carbon emissions into the atmosphere. Some of the arguments against disruptive direct action is the threat of prison, and that can have consequences for people who depend on you, parents, younger siblings, perhaps children. Also, there's the question of, are you targeting the correct people with your action, right? Look at that example of Ale. She felt like she had been targeted by Just Stop Oil's protest. So when we're taking an action, is it getting to the right people? Is it sending the right message to the right people? Also, the consequence of this might be that it's alienating the public. The wider public, by having their sports matches interrupted, say, for example, might be turned off and turned against the climate action movement. A lot of people might just put their hands up and say, look, it's not my problem. I don't need to do anything about it. And another kind of maybe more nuanced perspective might say that this kind of action doesn't influence anything, that governments don't listen to protests. Look at the example of Suella Braverman. She wasn't really listening there. And then we also need to ask as well, is disruptive direct action more effective than peaceful protest, like Dale Vince says? That's not something I can answer. That's a debate that you need to have in your groups. Okay, we've reached the end of this session, and I hope you enjoyed it. I just want to offer you something that you might do to follow on from this. Here is a challenge. I want you to take one of the actions that we suggested in the first part of the video. I want you to find out about the next Fridays for Future school strike, or maybe you can find a place that you can get out there and do some voluntary work teaching another class about the climate crisis. You can do that. Maybe you can lobby a politician, and in the next slide I'll link you to the Irish School Sustainability Network. And then also maybe you could create a piece of artivism or craftivism. If you do any of these actions, we'd love to see it. Share it on social media. Tag us, Irish School Sustainability Network there on the left, at Gap Ireland on the right, with a hashtag Climate and Nature Summit. I'd love to see the actions that come out of this video. There's the Fridays for Future, School Students Climate Action Network, Young Friends of the Earth, Flossie and the Beach Cleaners, we mentioned her as well. The Irish School Sustainability Network website is there as well, and Gap Ireland too. Finally, I just want to finish with a head, heart and hands reflection. Is there anything you've learned about climate activism? Have your feelings about climate activism changed? If so, how? And then is there anything you will do after this session? So that's it. Thanks so much for watching. I really, really appreciate you sticking with me. I hope you enjoyed this too. Thank you so much and goodbye.